در حالی که تظاهرات در خیابان‌های شهرهای مختلف ایران هر روز در حال گسترده تر شدن است، بسیاری به دنبال یافتن پاسخ این پرسش هستند که دولت دونالد ترامپ چه برنامه‌ای برای برخورد با آنچه در ایران می‌گذرد دارد. ایلان برمن، نایب رئیس انجمن سیاست خارجی آمریکا که از مخالفان جمهوری اسلامی است و همواره بر لزوم حمایت از معترضان علیه حکومت ایران تاکید کرده، میگوید ترامپ به دنبال تغییر رژیم جمهوری اسلامی نیست و اساساً استراتژی مشخصی هم در کاخ سفید در قبال اعتراضات مردم ایران وجود ندارد.
I don't think so, and I don't, at least not yet. I think it's very clear that President Trump is not a regime changer per se. Although his latest tweets suggest maybe that's changing, but I think the general view is that the president is escalating to de-escalate, right? He's setting red lines beyond which he will feel forced to act. But that's much different than simply saying the regime must change. I think if you're sitting in Tehran, if you're an Iranian official, you're certainly concerned, but you also very likely see a path through this. As long as they calibrate, as long as they can control their mechanisms of force, as long as they calibrate their response to suppress the protests in such a way that it doesn't trigger American action. I don't think there's really a regime change strategy of any semblance in Washington at the moment. There's really no appetite for it. Obviously, the example of Venezuela in recent days is really instructive. It's important because it has removed a prong of international support for the Islamic Republic, but it's also important because potentially it sets a precedent for how the administration is going to act in Iran. But Iran is not Venezuela. Iran's much further away. It's much bigger. It's much more complicated. And Iran has something even more robust than what we're seeing in Venezuela now. Right now, the next phase of American involvement in Venezuela is going to be focusing on the Venezuelan deep state. It's going to be focusing on the regime that Maduro and before him Chavez built that still remains in place. This exists in a much more robust fashion in Iran. So it's not simply a question of American military intervention. It's also the United States has to have a plan for dealing not just with the clerical elite, but dealing with the IRGC. And this creates, I think, an incentive for the president to do what he's doing right now, which is to threaten the regime in hopes that the regime modulates its behavior and hope that the regime contains its behavior so that America doesn't have to act. So this is something that I've been working on for years and years and years. And the answer is, sadly, we know far less than we should about the Iranian opposition. And here I think it's useful for the audience to understand that what we're actually talking about is not one opposition. We're talking about two wings. There are the Iranians themselves inside the country. They're the ones that are taking to the streets. These are, because of regime repression, these are much more loosely organized, much more spontaneous, but they're the ones in the fight. They're the ones who would be affecting change. And what you have in the Iranian diaspora globally, in the United States, in Europe, are a series of much better organized groups, whether they support the restoration of the monarchy or they support some other form of government. But these are the groups that are the most organized, the most vocal, and that are interfacing with American government and European governments the most. The question, which the United States government right now doesn't have a good answer to, is their degree of popularity and their degree of ability to drive events on the ground. I personally am very hopeful, but I'm also realistic. And you know, in my view, the protests are still lacking a couple of key ingredients. They're lacking a vision, right? The protesters know what they're against, but they don't really know what they're for. And also organization, communications, telecom, connectivity, messaging to the outside world. All these things are essential ingredients for rallying the type of support that the protests need in order to succeed. This doesn't mean that you're not going to see the protests grow, right? It doesn't mean that regime collapse won't happen necessarily, right? Sometimes it happens organically. But what it means is, I think on a larger level, is that there is this massive disaffection with the Iranian regime. So I personally don't know if now is the moment, but the trend line to me is very clear. Iran is heading in the direction of change. If not now, then soon.